Hi, I'm Dr. Ernest Johnson, and this is the class African American History, the Prelude to the Civil War. I'd like to start by framing the discussion with the view that African Americans were here during the initial English colony in Jamestown. That colony was founded in 1607 on indigenous land, and by 1619, at least 20 African Americans were living inside of Jamestown and its surrounding areas. When Jamestown was attacked in 1622 and again in 1644, presumably those African Americans, those that survived, had been defending Jamestown. So the participation of Blacks in the military has an early origin in this society. And personally, in my own family, my research has led me to understand that I have had relatives that have fought in all of the major wars since the Revolutionary War, with possibly the exception of the Spanish-American War. They also have fought in all branches of the service: Army, Navy, Marines, Air Force, and Coast Guard. And there are many other families with similar types of military traditions. During the Revolutionary War, over 5,000 Blacks fought. Some were runaways, some were enslaved, fighting with their masters, and others were free. Several distinguished themselves during battle in the Revolutionary War. An example would be Salem Poor, who purchased his own freedom in 1769, and by 1775 had enlisted in the Continental Army, fighting the British to establish the free and independent United States. He distinguished himself by fighting bravely, covering the retreat of his troops, and firing a shot that killed the advancing commander of the British troops before he left the battlefield. So he's an example of that participation that we're talking about. Also, the first casualty of the war was Crispus Attucks. Crispus Attucks was a slave. He was a runaway. He had been enslaved. He ran away in Massachusetts. He worked as a longshoreman in and around Boston. And he was the first casualty of the Revolutionary War. He and another group of citizens stood up to the British soldiers who were patrolling the streets. They fired upon the Americans, and the first person killed was Crispus Attucks. He was described as a runaway, a mulatto fellow. He was both Nantucket, he was indigenous, and Black. He was about 27 years of age, 6'2", curly hair, and his knees nearer than common together. So African Americans have contributed in very notable ways to the founding of this nation from the 17th century. And then in the 18th century, fighting and dying in the Revolutionary War, and in fact being the first casualty in that war. This issue of slavery is one that progressed in the United States, creating division between the slave states identified here in the lower part of the map and the free states, colored green at the top of the map. We know in 1820, there was an attempt to maintain the balance between the North free states, the Northern free states, and the Southern slave states by alternating free and slave states coming into the Union. And so in 1820, Maine came in as a free state, and then Missouri as a slave state, with the provision that slavery would not occur beyond the 3630 parallel. And that was the agreement in an attempt to maintain the balance and to avoid conflict. And this conflict had really been there since the inception of the nation. If you go back to 1787 at the Continental Congress, Southern states entered with the ultimatum that if the slave trade is brought up for discussion during the Continental Congress, they will not participate in it. So there wouldn't have been a United States without the participation of the Southern states, or it would have been a quite different formulation. So this division was there at the initial founding of the nation, and it only festered over time. In fact, one of the architects of the senators who proposed the Missouri Compromise sent a letter to Thomas Jefferson asking him for his opinion of it. And Jefferson said he understood the rationale for it, but he feared that it only clarified the division between the North and the South, which was eventually going to lead to war. So he felt that the demarcation only really increased the chances of conflict between the North and South over the issue of slavery. He described that situation as having a wolf by the ears, saying that on one hand, you have justice. This would be freeing African Americans who had been enslaved. On the other hand, you have self-preservation. And he felt that, he argued that African Americans shouldn't be freed until there was a possibility to, in his words, remove them beyond the chance of admixture, meaning that he didn't want them to engage in his proclivity of interracial cohabitation or intermingling. So the conflict was then exacerbated by the end of the slave trade in 1808, when our Congress finally did take up the issue of slavery. And at that time, there was a tremendous opportunity to expand both southward and westward in the United States, because indigenous people had been removed from their land, with Indian removal in 1803 had been completed, moved to Oklahoma. And territory was now being claimed as part of the United States. So the 13 colonies were expanding westward. And there was great disruption within the slave system from the standpoint of African Americans. What was happening was that males, in particular, young males, were being forced marched and shipped to the lower South, all the way into Texas, in order to grow cotton. Cotton became the primary crop of the United States, and by 1860, it accounted for 60% of US exports. And so there was great turmoil within the African American community, and that turmoil was also experienced with the relationship between the US and US territories and Mexico. So by 1836, the slave owners had sent some of their forces into Texas. They were asked to leave. They refused to leave. They entered into a Spanish mission called the Alamo, where they fought against the Mexican army, who was trying to dislodge invaders from their territory. This purple area here was all Mexico at that time. And they fought, and then by 1836, the Mexican army was defeated, and Texas was claimed as a Lone Star state by America, and slavery persisted in Texas. Greater exaggerating and throwing fuel on the fire of the conflict between the free states and the slave states. This then resulted 12 years later in the war. Well, the war started earlier, but it was resolved in 1848, 12 years later, which was the Mexican-American War. And this war was really a war fought over territory. And the United States sent troops in and fought against the Mexican army and forced them south, went into Mexico, and negotiated a treaty for surrender. And that treaty was actually not negotiated with the president of Mexico at that time, who refused to attend it because he had had experience with the Americans in Texas, that's Santa Ana. And so the Americans negotiated with an ad hoc committee. And in that negotiation, they acquired 55% of Mexico. So all of this brown area, and they included Texas in it, represented 55% of Mexican territory. And that's what we claimed as our booty from the war. We took that much territory from them. So when you see Mexicans coming across the border into this area here, they know that history, and they realize that the compensation that we gave them, which was $15 million for all of this, oil-rich Texas, oil-rich California, gold-rich California, we know how wealthy this land is, was a steal. So, but that's not taken into consideration because we don't teach the history. So the push of slavery led to war with Mexico. And as we continue, we find that there's strong feelings on the side of many Americans, Abraham Lincoln being one, Henry Thoreau, the abolitionist debater, as another. Thoreau was protesting against the war. He was protesting against the idea of paying a poll tax for a nation that was propagating slavery and instigating wars. And so there were a number of white, very popular white abolitionists during that time, William Lloyd Garrison being the most famous of them, who were standing up against the war. Ralph Waldo Henderson Greeley and his papers, Wendell Phillips and others were also engaged in the abolitionist movement, which was a multiracial movement. That's the point that I want people to take away from that part of the conversation, but also the connection between slavery and war. So during this point in late 1820s, you had David Walker making his fiery appeal to America, to white Americans, saying that their notion of independence in the Constitution was hypocrisy because slavery was inconsistent with what they claimed to represent, which was freedom and justice for all. He said it's also inconsistent with the Christian religion, which they claimed to profess. He also said to what were called colored citizens, the Black citizens at that time, that they had to stand and to fight against the evils of slavery. And he made sure that his declaration was sent to the far reaches of the country, particularly into the South, where even though Blacks were denied to read, they got word of what was being said, particularly those that could access literacy. There were also many rebellions in the 1830s. You had Gabriel Prosser's rebellion, 1800, right through the 1830s with Nat Turner. And a lot of that rebellion had to do with just how horrendous the conditions had become in the slave states, the forced marching of men, the division of families, sending children, particularly male children, but south to work in fields, so separating families. And so that became intolerable to African Americans. And so the resistance to slavery started to intensify during this time. And luckily there were white allies who also participated in that abolition movement, which was part of the resistance. The main way that people resisted was to run away. And so you had an acceleration of people escaping slavery during this time. And you had both Black and white abolitionists speaking about resisting basically by any means necessary. So you had someone like a Charles Raymond who said, if I don't have privileges, I don't need to pay taxes. He said that in 1841. And later in 1846, Thoreau was making a very similar argument with the poll tax, saying that the law of the land is in fact unjust because it's not being applied equally to people. And so if you don't want to participate in the evil of slavery, do not fund the government which is invested in it. And that was both their positions during that time. Again, abolition was a multiracial endeavor. Again, African Americans took part in their own liberation. And so the Underground Railroad, we won't go into in detail in this lecture, we've covered it, but it was conceived of like you can conceive of the railroad system. That's because railroads were being built at the same time between the early 1840s onward in this nation. And so the Underground Railroad used the railroad as a metaphor. And so you had conductors who were people like Harriet Tubman, who carried people, right, who were the passengers. And then they carried them to a station. And from that station, they would be taken to another station. At the station, there would be a person who looked after them. That person would be the station master. And a person who coordinated networks of stations was called a supervisor. And they supervised the railroad in their vicinity, connecting people in their vicinity with safe houses, other safe houses, and also connecting them with conductors who would take them to refuge outside of their area, outside of their state, and even outside of the country into Canada. So Harriet Tubman was not only a conductor on the Underground Railroad, very famous for that, but she also appears as a spy for the Union Army. She was so familiar with the terrain of the South because she made so many forays into the South to first bring her family north, but then to bring other families north, that she was familiar not only with the terrain, but she also knew how to blend in, knew how to disguise herself and look unassuming so that she could pass from place to place. And so she was very useful to the Union Army and actually led an attack against Confederate fortifications along the coast. So Harriet Tubman, again, female participation in the war effort. Folks going as far north as Canada, taking a picture here. The Underground Railroad had to go into Canada because the US government was invested in slavery. And so they passed two federal acts in 1793 and again in 1850, fugitive slave laws. And those laws gave so-called masters the right to capture their so-called property. And of course, this idea of human beings owning other human beings should have no place in a democratic society, nor does it have any place in a society that considers itself Christian. In fact, it was not being practiced in Europe since the 14th century. And so here you are now in the 19th century, and it's reinstituted, and we have to ask ourselves why, and what gave the British and other European powers the motivation to want for their brother what they didn't want for themselves, to reinstitute a relationship between human beings that was considered to be barbaric, that was considered to be unevolved, that was considered to be unchristian. What caused them to institute it? And then what are the repercussions of that in terms of how so-called colored people, so-called former slaves are going to be constructed during slavery, after slavery, up into the present, because of that original sin. So folks went to Canada and they distinguished themselves in Canada. An example is Estes, bought himself out of freedom, and his family, then moves on the Oregon Trail out to California, purchases land in California, has his land taken unceremoniously from him by the railroad company. He wasn't compensated like many white men were when their land was taken. He then went north to Canada, established himself into Canada, and is one of the founding families in the Gulf Islands on Vancouver, Canada, right off of Vancouver, Canada. Emma Stark, who's the daughter of Estes and Sylvia and Lewis Stark. She then I'm granddaughter of Estes and the daughter of Lewis and Sylvia Stark, became the first school teacher in Nanaimo. She's the granddaughter of William Estes. So Black people, given the opportunity, went, prospected in California, ran into the racism that was rampant there towards African Americans, Mexican Americans, Chinese Americans, and then moved to Canada and found an opportunity to thrive in this new world like anybody else who was talented couldn't find that same opportunity inside of the United States. And that's critical, because in the United States, Black people were being considered less than. They weren't being compensated for their land when it was being taken from them throughout the United States. They had their businesses taken from them, their livelihoods taken from them. They were lynched, right? From the end of slavery right up until present in the eyes of some. But legal lynchings throughout the United States occurred, where thousands of African Americans were lynched. And this means murdered without trial and left hanging from trees. And this had to do with how they were constructed. They weren't constructed as American citizens. Their humanity was being denied because the Constitution itself was considering them 3/5 of a human being, meaning that slave states could count their slaves, but with using the ratio that every 5 slaves equaled 3 franchises. So literally, slaves were considered to be 3/5 of a franchise, and some people say 3/5 of a human being. And this was preposterous because, of course, they didn't have the rights of a citizen to vote, yet their presence was being attributed to the population count, which gave the South disproportionate representation in our government. And this is why they were able to dominate the early legislatures and executive branches of government. So disunion is on its way. I'm not going to talk a lot about the Kansas-Nebraska Act, but it is, have talked about that in previous lecture, but it is, an example where physical violence is being used to claim territory, new territory that was taken from indigenous people. Some of this land was part of the Louisiana Purchase, taken from indigenous people whom were never truly compensated for their land. And then the free state, the free soilers, as they call them, and the slave state representatives of the slave states fought it out. It's called popular sovereignty. This was the idea that the legislature has, that who settles this land will be determined by popular sovereignty, which basically ended up in folks shooting it out. The federal government had to send in troops to reestablish the peace between these Americans who were killing each other in order to claim the land for one side or the other. We talked about John Brown's relationship to that battle, but that's just an indication of that the war is on its way. In 1854, we talked about how now with acquiring Texas and this push westward, the golden goose is providing tremendous wealth for the slaveholders and for the nation, for the folks that own railroads, for the manufacturers, the textile manufacturers in the northern states. Immigration is, at a peak. And what's driving it is slavery, our primary product, our primary export, 60% of our exports. And it is spreading. It is spreading and wreaking havoc and disruption on indigenous people who are removed from their land, forced marched in the winter, and destruction on African Americans who, against all odds, formulated families during slavery and had those families disintegrated beneath their feet by forced marching and shipping the males to work on these cotton plantations that were expanding throughout the South. And most of it in these really dark areas here is where the majority of the cotton was being produced. And you see it's in the lower South. And so the economics of the Civil War, when you look at the value of slaves, because you had the expansion from 1830s of cotton, you can see that the value of slaves also increased with the expansion of cotton. And so they were a tremendous investment, of course, because if you own 20 slaves and were considered a planter, then you were wealthy. I mean, you had folks that were working for basically just food and shelter, if you can call slave quarters shelter, and if you can call the food that they had to eat food, and creating a tremendous profit margin for those who work, folks from can't see in the morning to can't see at night. Slaves not only could be worked to grow crops, but they could also work in other capacities. Some of them could be trained and they would go out and work, and then they would send their income back to their master. They could also be used as, because they were so valuable, as collateral, where a person could go and get loans from the bank in order to buy new land, like Thomas Jefferson did, because of the number of slaves that he owned. And they could be used in various other ways for your own self-defense, as they did in Jamestown, serving in the military, as we talked about, fighting in the Revolutionary War, building fortifications, mess halls, just a wide range of activities that generated wealth and generated advantage for those that owned them. So this contradiction that was there since at least 1787, so you might say that it was there from the moment that English colonizers decided that they were going to develop a unique body of laws to govern slaves, slave codes, and those who had once been slaves, free codes, so they had free slave codes and what they call black codes for the freedmen. And these were a separate body of law. And these types of dual standards applied to other people of color as well, to Mexican Americans and to Asian Americans and to indigenous Americans. But once that distinction was made, is that we're going to have laws that apply to rich white people, laws that apply to all white people, and then laws that apply to the others. Take, for instance, black codes. The inevitability of that is that you're creating this unjust society. And the problem with it is that you're trying to build a democracy on a slaveocracy. You cannot build a solid house on such a faulty foundation. It's a duplicitous and false foundation. You cannot build a democracy on that type. Lincoln said as much, when he came into office in 1860. He said, we're living in like a house divided. Half of it is slave, half of it is free. And a house divided cannot stand. It needs to be reunited. And the division came in 61, where the slaveholding states separated themselves from the United States and declared themselves an independent confederacy of slave states. They based their confederacy on owning slaves. What distinguished them from the rest of the country was they owned slaves. The primary wealth of this area of the country was slaves and the products produced by slaves and the collateral possible from slaves. Slavery was at the heart of this, no question about it. They talk about free states. Free to do what? Free to work other human beings for your own profit, as if they were animals. In fact, treating them worse than animals, because having to justify one's own greed, one's own immorality, by claiming that these other human beings were less than human, therefore justifying the treatment. In fact, coming up with the false narrative that African Americans who were enslaved enjoyed slavery. If so, why did they flee? If so, why did they flock into the Union so that they could get back into the South and free their ancestors? So the war was always going to favor the North if the North was serious about getting into the fight. The South started off with the momentum, but they had a structural problem. Fewer states, smaller population by 3 times, less property, double in the North, less capital, 10 times difference. Capital investment, almost 10 times different. Manufacturing, you see, great discrepancies, 10 times the value of production, railroad mileage, etc. So the South was at a deficit. What the South had was plantations and slaves. That was the primary investment in the South. And everybody other than the plantation owners suffered from the lack of development in the infrastructure and in the society outside of the slave system, and suffers to this day from it. So the North had a structural economic advantage over the South, which was going to really be determinant of this bloody war. The war was the bloodiest in US history, right? Nearly 640,000 men, women, and children were killed or died of disease between 61 and 65. Compare it, for instance, to World War II, 400,000. But the real consideration is that the population of the United States in 1860 was only 31 million, where during World War II, at the beginning of the war, it was 132 million. And so everybody knew somebody that was killed or injured in that war. It had a real impact on this society at the family level, at the community level. Everybody felt the brunt of the war, and it became very unpopular over time. You had problems with enlistment after 63. Frederick Douglass was saying that the war had always been inevitable. The war has to include the abolition, not just the defeat of the South, but the abolition of slavery, and that Black people need to be utilized in this war in order to turn the tide from the Southern advantage in the war, because they were convinced that they were fighting for the right of their state, that they were fighting for their own freedom, that they were fighting for all of these different causes. No, they were fighting because the slave masters, slave owners wanted to hang on to the golden goose, the golden geese that they had. That's why they were fighting, but they were convinced that they were being somehow wrong. Sound familiar? And Douglass was pressing Lincoln, got really frustrated with Lincoln in 1863, January 1863, when the Emancipation Proclamation became law, that the slaves weren't freed, weren't recruited into the military initially in 1863. It took to the end of 1863, early 1864 before it happened, and all during that year, you found heavy criticism of Lincoln by Douglass. Over time, Douglass modulates his view of Lincoln, but he was very frustrated because Lincoln was really a pragmatic person, but it showed in the long run that he did have vision. One example is he frustrated people when he allowed what they called the border states to maintain their slaves. And so when the Emancipation Proclamation was declared in 63, January of 63, it was only declared for slaves in the states that were in rebellion. But those border states that had slaves that weren't in rebellion were not their slaves were not freed in 63. And Lincoln's strategy here was not to increase the number of states that he'd have to deal with, because there's Missouri, Kentucky, West Virginia, Maryland, Delaware were all slave states. And he didn't want to have them joining into the Confederacy. So he allowed them to keep their slave states and therefore maintain the balance of power in the favor of the North. So these are times that frustrated a lot of people, but they turned out to be correct judgments in the end. About 2.5 million white troops fought. About 179,000 Black soldiers, and another at least 18,000. Sometimes you see 30,000, but it appears it was closer to 18,000 sailors. So about 197,000 Blacks. But in terms of the percentage of Black people, in the country at that, a high representation of percentage of them joining into the military and fighting for freedom and wanting to go back south and fight to emancipate other Black people, starting with their families. During the war, Black people distinguished themselves in various different ways. One was Robert Smalls. He was operating in South Carolina, cotton steamer. A lot of the wealth of the South was still coming from cotton during the war. And he learned, how to navigate. He became an actually expert navigator. And so he devised the scheme to enter the ship at night and to disguise himself as a ship captain and to sail out of Charleston Harbor, past the sentries, wearing the cap of a captain, skewering his own face. And then he sailed right out to the Union blockade and turned the ship over to the Union Army. Oh, he met his family and some other folks on the shore, right? And picked them up before he went and took them all to freedom. And he said something very cryptic when he arrived at the Union vessels in the blockade. He said, Uncle Abe might have some use for this. So that was Robert Smalls. He went on to be a U.S. congressman from South Carolina, and he was very vocal. He was very courageous as well, because there were lots of threats against his life in South Carolina, because he was really trying to advocate to take care of the freedmen after the war, right? To invest in them, to give them land, to give them tools, to give them training, to give them access to education, to allow them to learn how to read. He was advocating these things which the Southern plantocracy was adamant not to allow to happen. And there's consequences to that. Women's participation in the war. Wow, Mary Shad Carey. She was amazing. Wanted to go to law school, went to Howard University, historically Black college, and found that they weren't enrolling women in the law school there, and became outraged with the fact that even though she was top of her class, she could not get enrolled in Howard Law School. She worked for a while for Frederick Douglass's newspaper, the North Star, and then she went and up to Canada and developed her own newspaper called the Provincial Freeman. Right? She was the editor of this paper, the founder and editor of this paper. And then she was amazing in her critique of what was going on during the time. She critiqued some of the encampments of Blacks in Canada, where she felt that there was too much discrimination, and there was too much romanticism around escaping to Canada, that are not enough real not enough investment in the facilities and training of the people who were coming to the facilities. So she was an amazing woman, right? And she went on to practice law late into her 60s. She was a very powerful abolitionist during her time. And her connection with the war is she was the only woman who actually was, not Black woman, the only woman who was recruiting Blacks or recruiting soldiers into the Civil War, right? She's the only woman doing that during her era. So remember her, that's Mary Shad Carey, an example. And during the war, a lot of Black people fled to Union lines. If they loved the plantation so much, why did they overrun the Union lines when Union soldiers came south? To the point that the Union soldiers didn't know what to do with them. Initially, they considered them property, so they gave them back to their masters. And then General Butler said, wait a second, they're using these slaves to grow food, to build fortifications. They haven't armed them yet, but they're helping their war effort. We can't return them. And so he got Congress to enact confiscation acts in 61 and 62 where blacks were considered contraband property, right? That had been captured during war and could be rightfully held by those who captured it, because otherwise they would be used in the war effort against the Union Army. So these acts were passed, the two confiscation acts, and Black people then started to be utilized by the Union Army as early as 1861. Wow, yeah, early as 1861, because as soon as Northern troops appeared anywhere near them, they flocked to them, left those plantations, left everything, and ran to the Union lines. This created greater disruption in the South. The Southerners now had to keep eyes on their workforce. And at the same time, they always had fewer resources than the North, and they had to use some of those resources to make sure that blacks were not going to rebel against them, or too many were going to flee to Union lines. So that was great. The soldiers fought with great heroism and distinction. Most of them were in the infantry. Many of them were placed on the front lines. Gloria is a good movie that talks about this with the 54th Massachusetts. Some became officers, and the infusion of the Black soldier into the war helped to turn the tide of the war when recruitment was dwindling, because the war had become very unpopular by 1963. And whites were really questioning whether or not this is not just a war to end slavery, and why should I go die for that? Especially immigrants coming into the country who didn't want to be recruited. There was huge riots in New York when they were trying to recruit new immigrants, Irish immigrants and others, to fight in the war, one of the largest riots in the history of the country. And they went also around attacking the Black community, because the federal government was trying to recruit immigrants to go fight in the country that they came to, sort of saying, you know, we're at war. We need soldiers. And they didn't want to fight for a war that had to do with helping Black people, what it seemed. So racism was just part of the environment, whether it was north or south. The soldiers turned the tide. Lincoln said as much. He talked about his blacks and blues turning the tide of the war. Sojourner Truth, in her cryptic, very clear way, said it's fine that this, Black men are starting to get their rights, but she wants women's to get theirs as well. This was after the war. During the war, she said, niggers always have to clean up after white folks. So that was her comment when they talked about Black troops entering into the service, being mustered into the service. That was her comment. And clean up they did. But they fought with different standards, and they experienced different standards than did the white troops. An example is the Fort Pillow massacre, where Union soldiers of Tennessee regiments, they were surrendered along with Black regiments to the Confederates, and the Confederates murdered all of them. They murdered soldiers that had surrendered to them instead of taking them prisoner. And it started with their outrage at the Black soldiers, and then the white soldiers, because they're fighting alongside them and killing their comrades, were swept up in it. And it was one of the most vicious and horrible acts of the whole war, which was the systematic murdering of soldiers who had surrendered. It was led by General Nathan Bedford Forrest, who went on to become the Grand Wizard of the KKK. He later denied that the massacre occurred. He also later denied that he was ever the Grand Wizard. He was only a Grand Wizard for 2 years, but documents suggest otherwise, that he was the general commanding those troops. He was actually a pretty good soldier in terms of his tactics, very good, in fact. One of the few soldiers that entered the war as a private and became a general. That's so rare, but he did it. And it was because he was educated, but because also he knew how to fight. He knew how to command men. He was particularly good with cavalry strategies. But anyway, this man who led this massacre went on to found the KKK and was the head of the KKK. They called it the Grand Wizard. And that's the Ku Klux Klan, is a white supremacist, racist, horrendous organization of people who spend their time terrorizing other people, right? And despite whatever else they claim that they do. That's their main work. And I experienced it myself personally when I was in Virginia. And this is in the 1960s, where we had a new Black teacher at the school, and we went to visit her during homeroom. And when we got there, she was crying. And we said, what's going on? She could barely gather herself. And then she pointed, and some of these kids I went to school with, this is middle school, walked up to her and gave her a card, which was from the Knights of the Ku Klux Klan, and saying something ominous like, this is just a friendly visit, but watch yourself, or something like that. And it really destabilized her. This is in 1960, I want to say 67, 68. So they're a despicable organization of people, and they train their children, many of them, to be the same. Luckily, the organization is not as strong as it used to be, but others have seemed to have taken its place. So bringing it to a close, Blacks fought in the regular army. They also were considered contraband. And so sometimes the contraband was organized into units, and they would basically do like scavenging and salvaging kind of duty. And so they would go into the plantations in the South and find anything that could be confiscated, whether it's foodstuffs or whether it's actual wealth that could be used for the Union cause. They did that. Those were the contraband. But then you had those that distinguished themselves as soldiers and even as officers. One of them was like Martin Delany. Martin Delany goes on to be kind of the father of Black nationalism. He's a very brilliant man. In fact, he gained admission into Harvard. And when he arrived, the students did a petition along with their parents and forced the administration to disallow him admission after he had gained admission into Harvard. He was so outraged that he spent his time between the 1850s and the outset of the Civil War in 1861, trying to organize Black people to return to Africa. Because he said, if I can't be accepted in this society, what's going to happen to my brothers and sisters, right? And so he ended up being a recruiter, and he ended up being the highest ranking Blacks in the military as a major during the Civil War. Lincoln went on to give him an office after the Civil War and so forth. And I'll end with, so Martin Delany, I'll end with my own family, both my mother and my father's side. I have two great grandparents who fought in the Civil War, George Winston and Riley Shepard. George Winston on my mother's side, my two great grandfather, escaped from a plantation in Drury Bluff near Richmond. He then ran to Philadelphia. He actually came by ship to Philadelphia, and he was processed by William Stills in Philadelphia. He then, because of the Fugitive Slave Law of 1850, went all the way up to Canada. He stayed in Canada until 1864, when he heard, after the Emancipation Proclamation, and he volunteered to join the Union Army in Concord, New Hampshire in August of 1864 at the age of 23. He fought until the end of the war, in like April of 65. He shared with my great aunt and my grandmother that much of the fighting that he was in, and he was in fighting in Mechanicsville. He was there when Lee surrendered. His unit, the 127th, was there when Lee surrendered in Appomattox, Virginia in 1865. So they were in the heat of the battle. But he talked about the fact that most of their combat was hand to hand. You'd get one shot with a musket, and then you would be using your bayonet and fighting hand to hand. And he was very proud that he never got injured in his time in the military. Luckily, he didn't serve a long time in that war, because that was kind of rare to come out of it unscathed. But he came in August of 64, and it's over by April 65. In that time, he fought his battles. This is the flag of the 127th, and it's really, it's a collector's item. I don't have it, but it was painted by an African-American. So you have a flag from the U.S. colored troops, 127th U.S. colored troops. And the flag itself is painted by David Bustill Bowser. And I was telling you about my own family's military history and my father being a senior officer in the Army. And so with that, I want to conclude this presentation on the prelude to the Civil War, and we'll talk more later.